Khaled SHERIF is a chief economist at Abu Dhabi Department of Economics Development, former vice president, regional development integration and business delivery. SHERIF studied economics and public policy at the American University of Cairo, earning a bachelor's degree in economics in 1981, a master's degree in economics in 1983, and a second master's degree in political science in 1989, as well as a PhD in public policy and management from Boston University in 1986. Under his leadership, the Africa region's yearly lending volume increased from less than $4 billion to more than $8 billion. He has extensive expertise managing operations in the Middle East, North Africa, South and East Asia. He was responsible for strategic planning and policy formulation across the World Bank's activities in Africa. He formerly worked for the World Bank's Human Development Network as the Chief Administrative Officer, Network Operations, where he oversaw almost $2 billion in bank-executed trust funds. Ladies and gentlemen, make welcome to GPAD 2022, Khaled SHERIF.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, and very happy to be back in this very important forum and to be with all of you today. So I think I will start us off this morning by talking about what basically is the perfect storm for Africa. Africa has obviously, like every continent, been through the challenges of COVID-19. We've now been looking at more so the challenges related to the war between Russia and Ukraine and what that actually means for Africa. And then we've also seen exogenous shocks coming to the continent vis-a-vis many other things that are affecting African economies, especially the consequence of African currencies that are now in a free fall. And so generally, this is really the perfect storm for Africa. And so as the world economy stumbles towards global recession, the reason that this is happening in part is it's been driven by a very strong dollar. National currency devaluations in Africa is now becoming the norm rather than the exception. And African currencies continue to depreciate against the dollar virtually without exception. Now, why is this important for us to mention today? The reason it's important is with approximately 50% of all international trade undertaken in dollars, a strong greenback, a strong dollar, is leading to import inflation all across Africa and in countries that are heavily import dependent. So roughly about 38% of Africa's grain is imported, and the war in Ukraine has caused the price of grain to grow exponentially in commodity markets. But it isn't just the availability or the lack of supply that's basically making foodstuffs more expensive on the African continent. It's also because the strong dollar is what you need to purchase to actually buy that grain or buy the foodstuffs or the commodities in African countries that you import. If the dollar is strong, it basically means that everything you're importing into the continent is more expensive, and our currencies are also declining against the greenback on a consistent basis. So top among the worst hit currencies on the African continent is Ghana's cedi. The cedi has lost about 40% of its value against the dollar so far in 2022. Also in 2022, the South African rand has depreciated by 9%. The Kenyan shilling declined by 6%. The Egyptian pound has lost between 20 to 25% of its value against the dollar. And Nigeria's naira has depreciated by 22.4% in the parallel market. What that basically means is that everything is now more expensive for African countries, especially the strongest African economies, to buy, to import. But it also means that to pay off your foreign debt, you have to purchase hard currencies, US dollars specifically, And that means your debt service has all of a sudden appreciated as well. And so basically debt service is a bigger problem as long as your currency is worth less and as long as it costs you more to buy hard currencies to pay off your debt. So now we're beginning to see a free fall in terms of debt service payment obligations that are becoming due, that countries are not able to keep up with. Their foreign reserves are depleting, and it is becoming a full-blown crisis. So, of course, it's not just Africa that's feeling the pain with a very strong dollar. The British pound has fallen to its lowest level against the dollar since 1985, and the Japanese yen is at its weakest since 1998. The euro, meanwhile, dropped below parity with the dollar for the first time since 2002 in late August. But the euro's depreciation directly affects the 14 predominantly West African countries that use the CFA franc, which is pegged to the European currency at a fixed rate. So for these West African countries, when the euro rebounds, they may find relative relief as they have pegged currencies, but the Ghanaian cedi, the Kenyan shilling, the South African rand, the Nigerian naira, and the Egyptian pound are not likely to see a significant rebound. They rarely do. Once those currencies depreciate, they rarely appreciate once more. So when these currencies adjust downward, as I was saying, their upward rebound tends to be muted. Once these currencies depreciate, they don't tend to show significant appreciation thereafter. So what does this mean for citizens of the countries affected by significant depreciation? What it means is that the purchasing power parity of their domestic currency holdings will remain forever altered. So let's say, for example, you have a currency that, whether it's the naira, the cedi, the rand, the Egyptian pound, and you had in 2021 what was the equivalent of $100,000 in conversion against the greenback, against the dollar. Now, if your currency sees 25% depreciation, then effectively your savings have gone from $100,000 to $75,000. Literally overnight, your wealth has vanished. This has implications all across the board. It basically means that everything has become more expensive for us. So it isn't just the import inflation, because an expensive dollar means it's more expensive for us to import commodities, since most of world trade is done in the US greenback. It isn't just the Russia-Ukraine war that's making the cost of wheat exponentially high. There's also another thing going on in the perfect storm, and I will come back to the currency challenge in a second. So if you take Ghana, for example, or if you take the Ivory Coast, most African countries depend not on the production of commodities. Most countries, 54 African countries, 26 of them basically export raw materials. They export cocoa beans, they export coffee beans as an example, which is basically what Ghana and the Ivory Coast specialize in. Together, cocoa beans from Ghana and from the Ivory Coast represent about 20%, just under 20% of world production. But commodity markets have collapsed for cocoa. So now, basically, the revenue we were getting from cocoa beans is less in hard currency. It's costing us more money to buy hard currency to service our debt, and it's costing us more money to import commodities that people need, consumables, especially foodstuffs, and then more importantly, for the average consumer, your own wealth has declined because the value of your currency, that peg, has declined against the greenback. So it's a multitude of factors. So for citizens of countries affected by significant devaluation, it isn't just the impact on countries' ability to debt service. What this likely means is that the purchasing power parity of consumers of their domestic currency holdings, which is declining, may never recover. And this means that the same basket of goods they consume will now be more expensive to them in comparison to other nations with no relief coming in the short term. So basically, we're talking about a whole class of citizens across both less developed countries in Africa, middle income countries in Africa, losing wealth. And so when we start to see this decline in wealth, when you see costs of basically everything, import inflation coming to be, and inflation in some countries averaging between 12% to 27%, with African inflation now topping up at around, on average, 18%. This is quite a hit for Ghanaians, for Nigerians, for South Africans, but it's more misery for Sierra Leoneans, it's more misery for countries like Somalia, for Zimbabwe, which have much larger challenges. And then you're talking also about a middle class that's facing significant losses in savings. And when that happens, the concern is that in these countries where the middle class deteriorates even more, the concern is that aggregate consumption will drop. And when this happens, aggregate demand for goods and services goes down too, inducing producers to produce less. I mean, if people are spending less, producers will produce less. And in turn, when producers produce less, they demand less labor. And when they demand less labor because they're producing less, this leads to higher unemployment. So basically, inflation leads to lower consumption, leads producers to produce less, leads demand for labor to decline, and leads unemployment to go up. So there's a direct relationship between the inflation that we're seeing, which is import inflation, with the very high levels of unemployment we're now seeing across the African continent. So what's the fix? Can these countries increase the value of their currencies once more? They can try different policies. One is to sell foreign exchange assets and purchase their own currencies. The second is to raise interest rates to attract hot money flows. Each of these has serious implications for these economies. The third is to reduce inflation by making exports more competitive, but this is a long-term strategy. And the fourth possibility is supply-side policies to increase long-term competitiveness. But as we say in economics, this is more in the medium term or the long term, and as Keynes would say, in the long term, we are all dead. So none of these actions will likely generate at least short-term relief. So this implies that for now, consumers across a variety of African countries will see hardship that is at least in part the result of not anything that Africa has done. It's exogenous shocks. And let me give you an example of an exogenous shock. So we have basically our lower developed countries, our less developed countries, 18 of them, that export basically raw materials, whether it be coffee beans, cocoa beans, whatever it may be, materials for production. The factories are not in our countries, they're not in Africa, they're somewhere else, and someone needs that product to make chocolate, to make coffee, by exporting it from our nations. In middle income countries, you have industries, but those industries exist primarily because of cheap labor. For those industries, about 89% of their intermediate inputs is imported. So to make the product, if you're making juice, you have to buy the flavor and you're importing it. You have to buy the preservative and you're importing it. But if almost 9 of every 10 intermediate inputs are imported, and most of trade being done in US dollars in greenback, that basically means it's more expensive for me to import those intermediate inputs. Thus, it's more expensive for me to make the juice, to assemble the cars, to assemble the refrigerators. And those costs have to be passed on to consumers. This is what we call import inflation. So we have industries that don't have a viable supply chain, an internal supply chain. The intermediate inputs that make the car, that make the washing machine, that make the juice, that make the bread are imported. When the dollar goes up, the price of intermediate inputs goes up, raising the cost of production, and this carries over to the consumer. When the consumer sees prices go up, the consumer spends less, demands less goods and services, the producer produces less. When the producer produces less, you demand less labor, and unemployment goes up. So one answer to this problem is to make sure that the supply chains for intermediate inputs are all predominantly domestically produced. And this is why the African Continental Free Trade Agreement is so important. That if we can develop a system of supply chain that is not dependent on foreign currencies, but on our own, this will negate import inflation. But we can't negate import inflation overnight. What I've just described is a long-term fix. But just to round off the discussion, and in a way of summarizing the problem, let me explain also that when you have this level of currency devaluation, this level of inflation, whether it's a process of induced by an expensive dollar or induced by wars outside the African continent, there is something called the Gini coefficient. And the Gini coefficient begins at 0. The farther it goes away from 0, it basically means that there is a distortion between the rich and the poor. The further it goes away, the rich are richer and the poor are poorer. And when the Gini coefficient is distorted, it basically leads to problems, both socio-political problems, as a result of this tremendous gap between the rich and the poor. Now we're beginning to see the Gini coefficient deteriorate across the African continent. Not just in middle income countries, but also in less developed countries. That is, the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. Well, why is this happening in the perfect storm? This is happening because when you own assets, if you are a wealthy person and you own land, inflation makes that land worth more. So you have a stock, an asset that's worth more to you, even though the cash you may have in the bank linked to a hard currency is actually worth less. But the assets that you own are actually worth more. If I have nothing except a small savings account and I basically don't have a physical asset, land or something similar, capital of some sort, then I'm just becoming poorer while my neighbor is becoming richer. This is a concern for the continent. Stability depends on a stable Gini coefficient. When the Gini coefficient becomes more distorted, then for our colleagues that are more political scientists, then this induces turmoil within societies, and this is the ripple effect. It's basically the problem of rich and poor. Industry we talked about, industry dependent on importing intermediate inputs from abroad, will always be dependent on the dollar being stable against our currencies. If we only import raw materials like coffee beans or cocoa beans, if again, the commodity markets are high, the world economy is prospering, great. If the world economy is going into global recession, the demand for our raw materials is going down, we will have problems. This is what we're seeing now. But just to close on the perfect storm, there is also a discussion on wealth that I mentioned. So if all I had in the bank was $100,000 equivalent in cedi, in Ghanaian cedis, in 2021, in today's exchange rate regime, my $100,000 has, my cedis have lost 40% in value. So my savings went from $100,000, they're now 60. If they were 50,000, I now only have $15,000 left in purchasing power parity. This is what's affecting the middle class, but it isn't just that. It's also that we're beginning to see across countries in the African continent, gross domestic product, the value of everything we produce in particular countries growing. And when you take GDP and you divide GDP by the total population, you get GDP per capita. So gross domestic product divided by population is GDP per capita. So when GDP grows, and we've seen in our middle income countries, all of these countries growing by 3 to 4% per annum, except in 2022. And GDP per capita rises with it. But when we discount inflation, our countries are getting richer. And with inflation, our citizens are getting poorer. So how can you have a continent where the continent is getting richer? The majority of its middle income countries are getting richer as states. The majority of our less developed countries are getting richer as states, but their own citizens are getting poorer. And this is the effect of inflation. Whether it's import inflation induced by an exogenous shock, the reality continues to be that Africa is the only continent in the world that is basically seeing state finances improve while the livelihoods of its citizens decline. Now, the only way you can address this particular phenomenon is instead of making the coffee, instead of selling the coffee beans or selling the cocoa beans, you have to produce most of the value addition domestically. You actually have to reap the benefits of the final product. We export gold. Gold makes cell phones, but by the time the cell phone is made, the value addition to the cell phone from its components is over 4,000%. The African exporters of gold that's going to those phones only benefit to the tune of 7%. So unless more manufacturing comes to our shores, unless more value addition comes to our shores, we will always suffer from import inflation. Our intermediate inputs for industry are imported. And on top of it, if the cost or the export prices of our commodities, our raw materials that we export also decline because commodity markets are not strong in a global recession, this is the perfect storm. So what can Africa do? Well, in the short term, unfortunately, it can only suffer. The issue is not what we're just focusing on today, which is COP27, and basically the whole concept of how we compensate a continent like Africa that is only responsible for less than 8% of CO2 emissions globally. So, to basically get funded for the impacts of global warming on our continent, that's only one part of this dilemma. The other part of this dilemma is the G20 being willing to help Africa get part of the wealth that industries out of Africa are not providing to it. As long as Africa continues to be only the provider of raw materials and is not making its own intermediate inputs, that wealth transfer will not happen to Africa, and you'll start to see countries continue to get richer and its citizens continue to get poorer. The Gini coefficient will become larger, and then socio-political problems will become more serious across select countries. I wish I could give you a short-term fix. Most of what can fix this problem is long-term, but Africa is resilient, and the progress so far over the past several years has been good, but the challenge remains enormous. Thank you very much for your time.